Hey everyone, so today is not technically a review, which you'll have guessed from the title. Instead, it's kind of like I did with Mass Effect last month, where the Mass Effect review I did, if you haven't already listened, go and listen to that first. Instead, it was part review and then it was part talking a little bit more in depth about why that game was so important to me and why that franchise was so important to me, in a kind of these are the games that made me a gamer kind of way. And today's video is very, very similar, but is not at all a review, I would argue. I'm going to gush a little bit about two games in particular, but I'm talking more about a genre and just using these two titles as evidence of why it's so important. So today we're talking about walking simulators. Now, if you've listened or watched my video about the game Paradise Lost that came out earlier this year, you'll have heard me talk a little bit about walking simulators before. As a quick recap, I'll explain a little bit more about what they are, so you don't have to go flick back through and watch that whole review. So walking simulators are a beautiful genre of games that tend to be a little bit more indie. You don't tend to get as many big names, although big name publishers and devs have been involved in them in the past. Walking simulators go back as far as the early 80s, in fact, so even back then they were kind of exploring this idea, and there's many games that will vie for the title of the original walking simulator. Now, the genre is characterized as having basically no game mechanics, or a void of complex game mechanics. You walk through a space, you occupy the space, you explore it, you may get to interact with it in a very minor way, such as picking up pieces of paper that help tell a story, but it is completely focused on the story. There's no puzzle element, there's no shooting element, there's no combat element whatsoever. It is just about walking, having next to nothing except from the story and the visuals. And also they tend to have stunning soundtracks, that's another thing. So the narrative focus is incredibly important in these games, and this is one of the things that I had a problem with in Paradise Lost, is that it didn't have a strong enough narrative to carry it. Now, going back to the first original walking simulator, most scholars and gamers would say was Dear Esther in 2008. It's considered the first real example of the genre, which was kind of rounded off. But even that in itself is a complicated statement, because technically this was a mod for Half-Life 2 when it first came out, and it wasn't actually published as its own game for a while after that. So the walking simulator has its origins not as real games, in quotation marks. Now, the writer of Dear Esther, Dan Pinchbeck, once stated when people asked him, what made you try this game, was that he wanted to look into, and this is a direct quote, what happens when you ditch traditional gameplay out of an FPS space and what that leaves you. So you have nothing but story to keep a player engaged. Is that possible? What kind of experience does that leave? What does the space you free up by losing all those game mechanisms and activities allow you to do? So, as you can see, we're already getting into quite an interesting sort of meta idea of gaming, of what actually is a game. If you take all of these elements out and you are just left with this narrative and very minimal options for gameplay, is it still a game? Now, I'm going to leave that as an open question for you, because some people loathe walking simulators, some people love them, some see them as the pinnacle, some see them as the worst. I love them personally. I think they are an incredibly important part of video games as a whole. You need something like this to remind you kind of the very basics. Now, the developer and publisher of Dear Esther, when it came out as its own game, called the Chinese Room, and they later released what they called a spiritual successor to Dear Esther called Everybody's Gone to the Rapture. Now, this isn't the game I'm actually going to talk about today, even though it is a beautiful game set in the British countryside, and it's bizarre and beautiful, and the soundtrack is just probably my favourite soundtrack from a walking simulator or game in general to have ever been made. But instead, I'm going to talk about what I think personally is a better successor to Dear Esther, which is What Remains of Edith Finch. Now, this is a truly superb game. it is just so slick, and there isn't a single thing about it that I think should have been changed or could have been better. Whilst actually researching for this video, when I looked up when What Remains of Edith Finch came out, I was actually really stunned because it was only released 4 years ago in 2017. Now, this game is so important to me, I could have sworn it had to be much older than that. Like, it had to be at least, getting on for 10 years old. So it shows you just how much of an impact this game had on me. Now, as a quick synopsis, What Remains of Edith Finch has you play as the titular Edith Finch, and your mother has recently passed away and she left you a key that you don't know what it opens, but you assume it has something to do with your family ancestral home, which you've not been back to since you were younger, and you very suddenly had to leave due to a tragedy, but you start the game not quite knowing what that tragedy was. And as the game unravels, each room in the house has been sealed off by your mother previously, and each room is dedicated to a different person from the family, going all the way back through grandparents to great-grandparents, all the way back to the first of the Finches to come to America. And it's beautifully done in terms of talking about heritage and where we come from, and this idea, can you inherit kind of a family tragedy? And it's just heartbreaking the whole way through, and it's a snapshot into very complicated lives, and also just in general, we all have complex lives and family lives and histories, and you are part of this heritage of this family, but you might not know everything about it. Now, the second game I'm going to talk about, which is similar but also very much its own game, actually came out a year before What Remains of Edith Finch, and it's called Firewatch. So it came out in 2016, and this is another brilliant example, but it also isn't just following a pattern in order to, be classed as a walking simulator and be successful. It does plough its own path. Now, this one sees you play as a man called Henry. At the beginning, you go through actually text on screen that tells you the backstory to Henry, and it's a really clever way to start the game. So you just get a piece of text. You may get a couple of options for how Henry approaches that storyline, like, how you speak to the girl you see at a bar and things. So you just get into the mindset of this character from the get-go. And it's a really beautiful story because it spans kind of over a decade just in a few minutes of reading text, and there's more background and emotion in that than all three of Cyberpunk 2077's 3 unique openings thrown together. Sorry, I know I shouldn't. I'm going to keep throwing in sort of slamming Cyberpunk every so often because I'm still angry about that game. Anyway, something happens to Henry and his partner, and he needs to get away. So he follows an advertisement in a newspaper to become part of the Firewatch program. Now, this is a real thing that they do in the States and other places around the world, where you have people who go and live in these towers in the middle of nowhere in the national parks around America, and during the sort of hottest part of the season, keep an eye out for fires that may start either by a human hand, by accident, or just naturally because, dry forest is perfect tinder. And so Henry goes and he is living in one of these towers, keeping an eye out for fires, when weird things start to happen. His home gets broken into, he sees a strange man following him, or he thinks is following him, and it delves into this mystery. The whole way through, he is having conversations with a woman called Delilah, who is the head of his team of Firewatchers around the area. This is a really clever way of telling a story and having a reason for a character who is on their own to be continuously talking. And this is something that walking simulators in particular have to contend with. How do you tell a story if it is a singular human being following a path or exploring a space? So in What Remains of Edith Finch, she is actually telling the story to an unborn child. In Firewatch, Henry is talking to this woman Delilah, who is never actually physically seen in the game. You just communicate with her through a walkie-talkie. And other games have done this, so Paradise Lost, as I mentioned earlier, that kind of copies the Firewatch style of having communication through a microphone. But there's various other ways of doing it as well. Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, for example, does it through audio flashbacks. But it's a really clever way of trying to continue a story without it just being you pick up a piece of paper, you read the story, and then you move on to the next section. How do you get inside the head of these people? And the great thing about Firewatch as well is you get to choose some of Henry's answers to Delilah's questions, or whether or not you share information with her. And it's a really fun game, but it's also, again, it manages to create an amazing emotional response, given you have far less control over what's happening. Like, people talk about the reason the gaming is unique is that you are in control of the character, you are, firing the gun yourself, you're making these decisions for yourself. It's not like watching a film where you're just watching it happen and you have no autonomy. But Firewatch manages to give you some of that autonomy whilst also allowing you to still continue in the genre. So using these two stories, I've touched a little bit around this, but why walking simulators are important. So, as I said, they force the developers or the writers to strip back to the very essence of a game, which is to tell a story. This actually makes it a lot harder, I think, because although walking simulators only tend to be a couple of hours long, I think What Remains of Edith Finch you could probably do in a couple of hours. Firewatch is probably a little bit longer because you can wander at free will around this national park. But you still have to be able to corral the gamer, the player, into this storyline and make it possible for them to follow it, but while still giving them this level of autonomy I mentioned. This is one of the reasons why some people really don't like walking simulators, is because they would argue they're not a game, because you have to follow these paths to a certain extent. You can't, it's not like Red Dead Redemption where it's like, we've got this important mission for you, but you then can go the opposite direction and go shoot up a saloon. You can't do that in walking simulators. You have to eventually, even if you stand still for an hour, you still eventually have to make it to the next part of the story. And they also have to be really in-depth stories. They have to have a lot more going on for them. So What Remains of Edith Finch, for example, the whole way through the game, it's giving you visual clues about what is going to happen in the next part of the story. So when you first manage to get into the house, you see tins and tins of canned salmon and tuna. This is because Edith's older brother, who is one of the last stories you hear about, worked the local cannery, and so it's giving you hints about the story it's going to eventually tell you. So they can't use anything flashy to bulk out the story. And I hadn't actually thought about this before, but for example, there's no cutscenes in these games, or you might have one very much at the beginning, but for the most part you have no flashy bits to kind of continue the game without having the player be part of it. And this is something that again would make it easier to develop if they could use them, but it would also detract too much from the game, so they don't tend to use them. And the other reason walking simulators are important is because of the complex situations that they can talk about. You can have some really serious conversations in games using these. Now, I'm not saying that other game styles can't have serious conversations. Last of Us Part 2, for example, tells some very difficult stories. Other games, This Little War of Mine, for example, tell very serious stories without having to be walking simulators. But the walking simulator gives you time to examine it for yourself at your own pace, and can also talk about not only serious stories but quite complicated stories. So in What Remains of Edith Finch, for example, you're talking about so many different types of tragedy, but also pain and trauma. You're talking about, there's one scene where one of Edith's ancestors, Barbara, was clearly murdered, but no one's ever quite sure what happens, and so they've kind of developed a story in order to be able to cope with that pain. But her younger brother, who was there the night that she was killed, clearly never gets over it, and he spends the rest of his life living in a bunker under the house, and Edith doesn't even know he was there when she was living there. It's a really beautiful way to examine not just the human condition, but that in particular, to really look at character as well as narrative, and to make something totally unique and something that's totally beautiful. I mean, some of the most highly rated games out there are walking simulators because of just this factor that they can haunt you and they can linger with you, and you keep coming back to them and finding something very new in them, even though they are so short. So those two games in particular I think are wonderful examples, and I think people should definitely give them a go. But there are so many more out there, like I've kept name dropping across this, and I can't wait for there to be more. There's a lot of them out there, that there's not that many that contend with the highest caliber. I'm really looking forward to a new range of walking simulators hopefully coming out in years to come that can contend with the likes of What Remains of Edith Finch and Firewatch and Everybody's Gone to the Rapture and Dear Esther.